You wake up already exhausted. Before your feet hit the floor, your mind is racing through the list of things you need to do to make her happy today. Text her back immediately when she messages. Remember to compliment her outfit. Plan something special for the weekend. Show more emotion but not too much. Be more available but also maintain your independence. Communicate better, but don't be needy about it. The voice in your head never stops. It whispers constantly about how you need to be a better boyfriend, a more attentive partner, a more emotionally intelligent man. You've internalized every criticism she's ever made, every relationship article she's shared, every way she suggested you could improve yourself for her. You think you're in control because no one is directly commanding you. There are no visible chains, no obvious oppression, no clear villain forcing you to behave this way. But that's exactly what makes this trap so effective. You've become your own prison guard, policing your thoughts and behaviours according to standards you never chose but somehow absorbed. Today, I'm going to expose how modern men have become trapped in a psychological prison designed by women who understand that the most effective control doesn't look like control at all. It looks like self-improvement. The most sophisticated form of control is the kind you don't recognise as control. Modern women have mastered this technique by creating invisible expectations that men police themselves against, turning them into willing participants in their own psychological imprisonment. This invisible leash operates through what appears to be helpful feedback and loving concern. She doesn't order you to change. She suggests you might be happier if you worked on yourself. She doesn't demand compliance. She expresses disappointment when you don't meet standards you never agreed to. She doesn't threaten punishment. She simply withdraws affection when you fail to perform according to her script. The genius of this system is that it makes men feel like they're choosing to improve rather than being controlled into compliance. You think you're becoming a better man when you're actually becoming a more manageable man. You believe you're evolving when you're actually just adapting to someone else's preferences. This invisible control is more effective than direct commands because it bypasses your natural resistance to being told what to do. Instead of rebelling against obvious control, you enthusiastically participate in subtle manipulation because it's been disguised as personal growth. The leash tightens gradually, almost imperceptibly. First, it's small suggestions about how you could communicate better. Then it's concerns about your friendships and how they affect the relationship. Eventually, you're monitoring your own thoughts and behaviours to ensure they align with her unstated expectations. The most insidious aspect is that you start to believe this self-monitoring represents emotional maturity rather than psychological captivity. You've been trained to see your compliance as growth and your resistance as immaturity. Modern relationships have become performance societies where men are expected to constantly demonstrate their worthiness through emotional labour, behavioural modification, and endless self-optimization. This creates a dynamic where you're never good enough as you are. You're only acceptable as you're becoming. In this performance society, your value is determined not by who you are, but by how well you meet ever-changing standards of acceptable masculine behaviour. These standards are fluid, contradictory, and impossible to master because they shift based on her moods, needs, and the latest relationship advice she's consumed. The performance trap operates through the illusion of choice. You're free to be yourself, but only if yourself happens to align with her vision of who you should be. You have agency, but only to choose how quickly you'll adapt to her preferences. You have autonomy, but only within the boundaries she's established for acceptable male behaviour. This system creates chronic anxiety because the rules are never clearly defined and constantly changing. What makes her happy today might annoy her tomorrow. The emotional intelligence she praised last week becomes neediness this week. The independence she said she wanted becomes distance when she's feeling insecure. The performance society also ensures that you never reach a point where you can relax and simply be yourself. There's always another area for improvement, another aspect of masculinity that needs refinement, another way you could be more sensitive to her needs. Men trapped in this system become entrepreneurs of their own emotional improvement, constantly working to optimize themselves for female approval while never questioning whether this optimization serves their own interests. One of the most effective strategies for female psychological control is the systematic colonization of spaces that were traditionally reserved for male autonomy, turning even your private thoughts and personal time into territories that must be managed according to her standards. This colonization begins with the invasion of your friend groups, where your male friendships are evaluated based on how they affect her comfort level. Friends who encourage independent thinking or traditional masculine behaviours are subtly discouraged, while friends who support her narrative about relationships are welcomed. Your hobbies and interests become subject to her approval based on whether they contribute to your development as a partner. Time spent on pursuits that don't directly benefit the relationship is reframed as selfish or immature. You learn to justify your personal interests in terms of how they make you a better boyfriend, rather than simply enjoying them for their own sake. Even your internal emotional landscape becomes colonized as she establishes expectations about what you should feel, when you should feel it, and how you should express it. Your natural emotional responses are deemed inappropriate if they don't align with her preferences for how emotion should be managed within the relationship. The colonization extends to your decision-making processes, where major and minor choices are filtered through considerations of how they'll affect her mood, the relationship dynamic, and your standing as a worthy partner. Your autonomy is gradually eroded as you internalize her preferences as your own values. This colonization is particularly effective because it doesn't feel like invasion. It feels like partnership, collaboration, and mutual consideration. You don't realize you're losing yourself because the loss is gradual and disguised as relationship growth. The end result is a man who has learned to evaluate every aspect of his life through the lens of female approval, creating a psychological dependence that masquerades as emotional intimacy. The modern relationship trap operates through what could be called the violence of positivity. The relentless pressure to be optimistic, growth-oriented, and emotionally available that actually becomes a form of psychological oppression disguised as love and support. This violence manifests in the expectation that you should always be working on yourself, always be grateful for her feedback, always be open to changing behaviours that make her uncomfortable. There's no acceptable reason to resist improvement, no legitimate basis for maintaining patterns she finds problematic. The positivity trap makes it impossible to express frustration with the constant demands for change because any resistance is interpreted as close-mindedness, emotional immaturity, or lack of commitment to the relationship. Your natural defensive responses are pathologized as toxic masculinity or communication problems. Under this system, you're expected to greet every criticism with enthusiasm, every demand for change with gratitude, every boundary violation with understanding. Your negative emotions about the relationship dynamic are treated as problems to be solved rather than valid responses to problematic treatment. The violence of positivity also prevents you from acknowledging the cumulative cost of constant adaptation. You're not allowed to admit that changing yourself continuously for someone else's comfort is exhausting, because that would be interpreted as resistance to growth. This positive oppression is particularly insidious because it's nearly impossible to criticize. How do you argue against suggestions that you become more emotionally intelligent, more communicative, or more considerate? The content sounds reasonable. It's the relentless pressure that becomes oppressive. The result is men who have learned to smile while being systematically dismantled, who express gratitude for feedback that erodes their sense of self, and who mistake psychological exhaustion for relationship work. The most effective aspect of modern female psychological control is that it transforms men into willing participants in their own exploitation. Instead of being controlled by external force, you become the primary agent of your own psychological subjugation. This self-exploitation operates through internalized standards that you police yourself against. You don't need her to monitor your behavior because you've learned to monitor it yourself according to criteria she's established. You become both prisoner and guard in your own psychological prison. The engine runs on guilt, shame, and the fear of being seen as a bad partner. When you fail to meet the internalized standards, you experience these negative emotions automatically, creating powerful incentives to comply with expectations you never consciously agreed to accept. Self-exploitation also operates through the belief that your efforts to meet her standards are evidence of love rather than evidence of control. You interpret your willingness to change as proof of your commitment rather than recognition of your psychological captivity. The system becomes self-perpetuating because each successful modification of your behavior reinforces the belief that more modification is necessary. Every positive response to your changes proves that changing yourself is the key to relationship success, creating an addiction to self-improvement that serves her interests rather than your own. This internal exploitation is particularly effective because it feels like personal agency. You're choosing to work on yourself, choosing to be a better partner, choosing to grow and evolve. The fact that these choices serve someone else's agenda while eroding your authentic self remains invisible. The self-exploitation engine ultimately transforms you into a person who exists primarily to meet someone else's needs, while believing that this existence represents the highest form of love and partnership. One of the most overlooked aspects of psychological control in relationships is how women colonize male rest, turning even downtime and relaxation into territories that must be managed according to relationship standards. Your rest is no longer truly restful because it's been reframed as preparation for better performance as a partner. Sleep becomes about being well rested enough to be emotionally available. Relaxation becomes about managing stress so you can handle relationship challenges more effectively. Personal time is no longer personal because it's evaluated based on how it affects your capacity to meet relationship demands. Time spent on activities that don't contribute to your development as a partner is seen as wasted time that could be better invested in relationship improvement. Even your mental downtime is colonized as you learn to use quiet moments for reflection about relationship dynamics, analysis of her feedback, and planning for how you can be more attentive or responsive. Your mind never truly rests because it's always working on the relationship project. This colonization of rest creates chronic psychological exhaustion because there are no spaces left in your life that exist purely for your own restoration and enjoyment. Everything has been repurposed to serve the relationship system that positions you as the primary contributor and her as the primary beneficiary. The colonization is so complete that you may have lost the ability to rest without guilt, to enjoy activities without justifying them in relationship terms, or to have thoughts that aren't filtered through considerations of how they affect your status as a partner. The absence of true rest creates a psychological vulnerability that makes you more susceptible to control, because exhausted people have less capacity for resistance and independent thinking. If you're starting to recognize how your constant efforts to improve yourself for your relationship might actually be evidence of psychological control rather than personal growth, subscribe and hit that notification bell. What I'm revealing today about relationship dynamics could free you from patterns that are exhausting you while serving someone else's interests. Modern women have become masters of fragmenting male attention, creating a state of psychological hypervigilance where men are constantly monitoring multiple relationship variables simultaneously, making deep focus or autonomous thinking nearly impossible. This fragmentation operates through the introduction of multiple simultaneous demands for attention and consideration. You're expected to be aware of her emotional state, responsive to her communication needs, attentive to relationship dynamics, and mindful of how your behavior affects her comfort, all at the same time, all the time. The strategy creates a mental state similar to chronic anxiety, where your attention is divided between immediate tasks and relationship monitoring. You can't fully engage with work, friends, or personal interests because part of your mental capacity is always allocated to relationship management. This divided attention serves control purposes because it prevents the kind of sustained focus that might lead to independent thinking about the relationship dynamic itself. When your attention is fragmented, you're more likely to react to immediate situations rather than stepping back to analyze larger patterns. The fragmentation also creates dependency because the cognitive load of managing all these variables simultaneously is exhausting, making you grateful for any guidance or feedback that simplifies the complex task of being an acceptable partner. This attention management system keeps you in a state of chronic partial attention, where you're never fully present for anything, because you're always partially focused on relationship monitoring and management. The result is men who lose the capacity for deep engagement with their own interests, goals, and thoughts, because their attention has been permanently divided to accommodate relationship maintenance demands. The path to freedom from psychological relationship control begins with rediscovering your capacity to refuse demands that serve someone else's interests while eroding your authentic self. This refusal is revolutionary because it challenges the entire system of voluntary compliance that makes modern control possible. Refusal begins with recognizing that not every suggestion for improvement is actually in your best interest. Not every criticism represents valid feedback, and not every demand for change serves the relationship rather than serving her need for control. The revolutionary aspect of refusal lies in its rejection of the premise that you should continuously modify yourself to maintain someone else's approval. It asserts that your value as a person isn't dependent on your willingness to change according to someone else's preferences. This refusal requires developing comfort with disappointment, conflict, and the possibility of relationship loss because it threatens the psychological control system that many women have become dependent on for managing their own insecurities and need for certainty. The freedom of refusal doesn't mean becoming rigid, closed to growth, or indifferent to your partner's legitimate needs. It means distinguishing between requests that serve mutual interests and demands that primarily serve the control system. Refusal also involves reclaiming territories that have been colonized: your friendships, your interests, your thinking time, and your emotional responses, by insisting that these areas of your life don't require her approval or modification according to her preferences. The revolutionary act of refusal transforms you from someone who exists primarily to meet someone else's needs into someone who chooses when, how, and to what extent you'll accommodate another person's desires. One of the most damaging effects of psychological relationship control is the elimination of spaces where men can simply exist without performance pressure, improvement demands, or consideration of how their presence affects female comfort. These forgotten spaces once allowed men to recharge their psychological batteries, process experiences without external input, and maintain connection with aspects of themselves that exist independently of relationships. Without access to these spaces, men become psychologically depleted and increasingly dependent on female validation for their sense of self. The recovery of masculine spaces requires intentionally creating territories in your life that exist purely for your own restoration and enjoyment, without needing to justify their value in relationship terms or demonstrate how they make you a better partner. These spaces might include time with male friends who aren't subject to her approval, engagement with interests that don't require her understanding or participation, or simply periods of solitude where you can exist without monitoring your thoughts and feelings for relationship implications. The creation of these spaces often meets with resistance because they threaten the total access that psychological control requires. Your insistence on maintaining independent territories will likely be interpreted as selfishness, immaturity, or lack of commitment to the relationship. However, the preservation of these spaces is essential for maintaining the psychological independence necessary to distinguish between legitimate relationship needs and control mechanisms disguised as partnership requirements. The forgotten masculine spaces serve as refuges where you can remember who you are when you're not performing the role of ideal partner, allowing you to maintain enough sense of self to resist total psychological absorption into someone else's agenda. Perhaps the most sophisticated element of modern relationship control is the guilt transfer mechanism that transforms legitimate male frustration with unreasonable demands into self-blame for being insufficiently evolved or committed to the relationship. This mechanism operates by reframing your resistance to control as evidence of your personal shortcomings rather than as a natural response to manipulation. When you feel frustrated by constant demands for change, the guilt transfer convinces you that your frustration proves you need to work on yourself more, rather than examining whether the demands are reasonable. The transfer works by pathologizing normal male responses to excessive control. Your desire for autonomy becomes selfishness. Your need for space becomes emotional unavailability. Your resistance to criticism becomes defensiveness that proves the criticism is valid. This psychological sleight of hand is particularly effective because it uses your own caring about the relationship against you. Your desire to be a good partner is weaponized to make you compliant with demands that actually make you a worse partner by eroding your authentic self. The guilt transfer also prevents you from developing legitimate anger about being manipulated, because anger itself is interpreted as evidence of your emotional immaturity rather than as an appropriate response to psychological boundary violations. Breaking the guilt transfer mechanism requires learning to distinguish between legitimate self-improvement and manufactured guilt designed to maintain compliance with someone else's control system. This distinction allows you to separate actual growth opportunities from manipulative demands disguised as helpful feedback, restoring your ability to evaluate relationship dynamics objectively rather than through the filter of manufactured guilt. The ultimate goal of escaping relationship-based psychological control is not to become controlling yourself, but to recover your internal authority, the capacity to make decisions based on your own values, needs, and assessment of what serves your long-term well-being. This recovery requires rebuilding trust in your own judgment, after it's been systematically undermined by constant feedback that your natural responses, preferences, and instincts are problematic and need modification. Male authority isn't about dominating others. It's about governing yourself according to principles you've consciously chosen rather than standards imposed by others through psychological manipulation. It's the difference between self-directed growth and other-directed compliance. Recovering this authority means learning to evaluate relationship dynamics from your own perspective rather than automatically adopting her interpretation of what's happening between you. It means trusting your own experience even when it conflicts with her narrative about the relationship. The recovery process involves gradually reclaiming decision-making authority over your own life, starting with small areas and expanding as you rebuild confidence in your ability to determine what's actually in your best interest. This recovery often triggers intense resistance from partners who have become accustomed to psychological control because it threatens their ability to manage the relationship according to their preferences and insecurities. However, the recovery of male authority is essential for creating authentic relationships based on mutual respect, rather than psychological manipulation disguised as love and partnership. The fundamental truth about modern relationship dynamics is that many men have been trapped in psychological control systems that operate through their own desire to be good partners. This trap is particularly insidious because it uses your best qualities against you while convincing you that compliance represents growth. The system works by exploiting male psychology that values competence, improvement, and providing value to others. These positive traits are weaponized to create compliance with demands that serve female control needs rather than genuine relationship health. Understanding this trap doesn't require becoming cynical about all women or relationships. It requires developing the discernment to distinguish between partners who want to grow together and those who want to manage you according to their psychological needs. The men who escape this trap are those who learn to value their own psychological well-being as much as they value their partner's comfort, who insist on mutual rather than one-sided adaptation, and who refuse to accept that good partnership requires the erasure of their authentic selves. Breaking free from psychological control doesn't make you a bad partner. It makes you a partner who contributes from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion, and from authenticity rather than performance. The ultimate truth is that you are not stupid for falling into these patterns. You are trapped by systems that exploit your desire to love and be loved. Recognizing the trap is the first step toward freedom, and freedom is the prerequisite for authentic partnership. Share this analysis with any man who's exhausted from constantly working on himself for his relationship and needs to understand that real partnership doesn't require the sacrifice of his essential self. The difference between healthy growth and psychological control often lies in who benefits from the changes being demanded.